Hey there everyone, and welcome to Stronger with Time. I'm your host, Tony Boutagy. In today's episode, I sat down with Professor Louise Burke. Dr. Burke is widely regarded as one of the greatest of all time in the area of sports nutrition. She's been the head of sports nutrition for the Australian Olympic team for every Olympic Games from 1990 to 2018. She's the professor of sports nutrition at the Australian Catholic University in Melbourne. In a career that has spanned over 40 years, over 300 peer-reviewed papers, 6 textbooks or more on sports nutrition, and has rightly earned the OAM medal in Australia, which is a highly prestigious honour. In today's conversation, we covered why females have been underrepresented in sports nutrition research and what has been done about that, how to fuel as a female, whether you should train fasted or not. We talk about supplementations, especially collagen and bone broth, and we turned our attention to one of my favourite topics, which is coffee and caffeine. Today's conversation was a true masterclass by one of the greatest ever in the field of sports nutrition. Without further delay, please enjoy my conversation with Professor Louise Burke. Louise Burke, it is both an honour and a completely gratifying experience for me to be talking to you today, so welcome.
Thank you, and you're too kind.
How long have you been now working in the space of nutrition, sports nutrition?
I'll have to admit to 45 years, but I started when I was 2, so.
I have had a great time reading through your PubMed profile, over 430 papers. I was looking in my library, I have 6 textbooks written by you. I'm sure there's more, I just couldn't find them. I could ask you endless questions today, but we have a hard finish time. So I'm just going to pummel you with questions. And I really think today will be a bit like speed dating, but in terms of asking scientific questions. You have done an enormous amount in the world of female research and addressing this disparity of a lot of the research being done in men, and you have identified this and have addressed it.
I'll have to admit to being a culprit here, though, because I didn't pay attention to this until about 2018, and I was asked to speak on the topic of female athletes and sports nutrition. And I actually read some of the actual articles. You see these headlines saying females underrepresented in sports science, and I thought it was, there's not enough female sports scientists. I didn't realise that there was not enough female participants in studies. And when I read that, I went back and I had looked at my own census of studies, and I've been one of the terrible people that had not done the right thing in terms of making females front and centre of things. So since then, I've really tried to address my past sins, and we've got quite a few projects that we are now concentrating on working with females.
And why do you think that was the case? And you are right. I look back over training studies and it is protein consumption in men or fueling in men. And I just assume that there is an ample amount of males volunteering either as sports science students or as athletes who are happy to have biopsies taken and so forth. But there's always been female athletes. So why do you think this has been the case?
I can say that sometimes it's more difficult to get enough female athletes of the same calibre, and sometimes female athletes are harder to pin down for studies because, let's be honest, they don't get the same level of support in terms of resources and professional status for their activities, and so often they're holding down jobs at the same time as trying to be an athlete, and then fitting something else into the day is a little bit more difficult. We wondered whether there was a bit of a bias against doing studies around nutrition, because often females are fairly committed to the way they like to eat. And then often I've done studies with males and we fed them for 4 weeks with a, very pointed intervention, and males will just say, oh, great, free food. Whereas females will say, but that's not the way I like to eat. But if I'm being really honest, the problem for me was that I really didn't understand the menstrual cycle and menstrual phases. And I just get bamboozled with thinking about how am I going to do this study if is it important that when I'm testing females, they are all in the same menstrual phase? And how am I going to measure that? And does it mean I'm going to have to spend more money doing all these extra analytics on athletes too? And then if I find them that they're not naturally menstruating or menstruating regularly, then am I going to have to lose them from my sample? And so it was really probably the biggest problem, if I'm honest, is that I just didn't feel competent enough to tackle it. It just seemed all too hard. And so much easier to get a male who's got a much more predictable sort of reproductive system.
Right. I can see how that happens and the logic behind it. So then what changed your mind and what have you done to address the whole menstrual aspect? I notice in your list of publications, you've looked at performance in cycling, you've looked at resting metabolic rate, you've looked at body composition, and to see how the different hormones and how they flux across the cycle, how that impacted those indices you've looked at. So where did that all start and what have you done?
Well, look, I felt so embarrassed at what I hadn't done that I thought, look, it's just time to buckle up. I can't be criticising other people. And at my level of experience as a researcher, well, if I'm not willing to tackle it, how can anybody else be expected to do it? So I got the help of some other great people who work in this space, Kate Ackerman, Claire Minahan, Kirsty Elliott-Sale, people who've developed reputation for working with female athletes and always helpful to have somebody to learn from. But what we decided to do in fast-tracking things was to make sure that for every study that we did, we left a sort of a trail of breadcrumbs. And so a lot of our studies now, we write up the methodology of what we did and explain the pros and the cons and what we found worked well and what we found didn't work so well, so that we're trying to save other people the problem of making mistakes. And another thing we did was, and this happened partly because it's a good idea, but partly because COVID meant that we had to rethink what we did with our time. So while we were all shut down, we thought, well, we know there's underrepresentation of females in the sports nutrition literature, but if you're going to tackle something, where do you start? So we did audits across a whole range of different themes to find out where were the areas that females are most underrepresented. And it's not just the number of studies, it's how well they've been done. So if these studies that exist and make look like there is some female literature there, but if they've been done and they've poorly described or poorly controlled for menstrual status and phase, and that's important, well, then that makes you less enthusiastic about the studies that are there. And what we found is that it's interesting that amongst the groups of athletes that have been involved in many of the themes, we actually found that in some areas, better trained or more elite females had been willing to put their hands up to be participants in these studies than males. And so that's a good thing about females, that maybe those, if you ask them, invite them to be part of studies, they actually will come. We also found that some areas aren't as badly represented as others. And so if we pick areas like iron and calcium, for example, where there's more of a risk of a problem in females, we found the literature actually is more focused on those. So rather than have that doom and gloom, oh, everything's just terrible, we were able to then start picking up, well, what are some of the areas that are more deserving? And sometimes it's a matter of what's missing, but sometimes it's a matter of, is it likely that there's going to be a difference between males and females in this area? Because one of the risks that you have when you say to the world, oh, females haven't been addressed, means that then people lose confidence in the guidelines that are there. So rather than saying there's nothing for you, we'd say there are some great guidelines based on evidence. Now, some of this may need to be tweaked for females, but let's start with the idea that some of it is a good starting point. And it's not only your sex that means that you might need to tweak or individualise guidelines. We say that for everybody, that these are some ideas about a starting point for thinking about fueling or recovery or muscle gain or whatever it is that you're interested in. And all of us need to take those guidelines and say, right now I need to personalise them to my particular needs. And one of the issues that might make personalisation important could be sex, but there are other ones too. So we're trying to say, yes, it's not a crisis so much as there's a need to now start filling in some of the gaps that haven't been well addressed, but not to lose total confidence that there's not a good starting point for most people to see, yes, there's an evidence base for where I can start my journey with nutrition, and then I can find out the areas that need to be coloured in better. And also that there may be other reasons to personalise things rather than just male or female.
You see, I work in a world where that point that you've just made has really opened up a gap for many to come in and write books or have courses or even TED Talks on all of the studies have been done in men, which mean females, because of neuroendocrine reasons, require a completely unique set of exercise and nutrition prescription. And as someone who's been coaching for 30 years, I never had a male and female guidelines. I just had who was in front of me, and we would individualize based on that. And with everything you've just said in mind, perhaps we can talk about fueling the athlete and recovery for the athlete from what you have found generally, but also where potentially gender and sex might have a different place in glycogen resynthesis or muscle protein synthesis. And this is all from the lens of we're all aging. We realize we need muscle and strength and power and VO2 max and endurance as we age, and bone mass. And we want to address all of this with an exercise program and using nutrition to support it. Let's start with fueling the demands of training. Where are we now at 2025? I know you've gone through shifts in your thinking as new research has come out, primarily done by yourself and your colleagues. Let's talk about fueling first and then recovery second.
Excellent. Look, there's been speculation, and there's certainly, as you said, people out there taking advantage of the vacuum, maybe saying that, oh, females have got different reproductive hormones and that they make a huge difference to our metabolism, and that includes glycogen synthesis or glucose utilization during exercise. And so females have to do things totally differently to males. Now, yes, there are some subtle differences in the way when we're in a high estrogen or a high progesterone phase of a menstrual cycle that there may be alterations in metabolism. But I don't believe that's enough to say females should only do it this way and males should only do it that way. And more importantly, females should do it this way on Mondays when they're in this phase of the cycle, and it has to be done totally differently on other phases. And I just don't think there's enough evidence to say that there's sufficient difference to create an industry around that, if you like. And there are probably bigger things at play. So one of the things that I think is the difference between males and females is partly energy requirements, in that males have larger energy requirements because of their size and their muscle mass, and they may be doing higher training loads. And females have not just lower ones, but they have more angst and fear of overdoing calorie intake. And so they tend to underfuel, partly because they have fewer calories to buy that fuel with. But also they have some, even though logically and intellectually you can explain something to a female and they may, yes, I understand that and I can see that I need that to fuel the exercise that I'm doing. But I think a lot of females have a secret fear at the gut level that says, I don't really feel comfortable doing this. There's something terrible about carbs. I just worry that my body composition goals aren't going to be well looked after if I do this. And so if you do have either a real energy restriction or a fear of actually eating enough carbohydrate, then that's what makes the biggest difference between males and females. I think the differences that occur across menstrual phases or status are smaller than cultural and energy differences. And there have been a couple of studies which have taken male and female participants and done carbohydrate loading. And they've followed the same protocol. They've said, tell us what you normally eat, and so we know what your energy requirements are. And then what we'll do is we'll have you for 3 days on a normal diet, and then we're going to increase the amount of carbohydrate in your normal diet to carbo load. And when those studies have been done in that way, they've often found that the females don't increase glycogen during those days of the higher carbohydrate intake. And the problem when you have a look at the diets is that it looks like the females underreported what their true intake was. So they were eating less total energy than they really needed. And then even though you increase the carbohydrate content of that during the carbo loading phase, there was only a small total increase in carbs because as a percentage, it was a smaller starting point. But also being in energy deficit meant that the glycogen storage was reduced because it was not available for storage. It was needed for just today's use. And so you look at those results and one interpretation is, oh, females can't carbo load. But the better interpretation is females didn't do the same carbo loading protocol as the males in that study. And when the studies are done where females are actually made to eat the carbohydrate and energy, forget what they say they eat, give them a prescription based on what's needed according to calculations, and they could carbohydrate load just as effectively as males. So a lot of it goes back to the study design and not looking at it sort of matching it equally. So I would like to give females the courage and the confidence to say carbohydrate is a great fuel for many types of exercise, and whether you're fueling up to do it or recovering afterwards or loading it up, whatever your event is and its requirements, then, go for it. It's a proven way of being able to fuel certain types of sports. And so following those guidelines, and it might be that the energy required to do that, say something like a carbohydrate loading where it suddenly becomes a much amplified intake of carbohydrate, that mightn't be the total calorie requirements that you have on an everyday life. But if you're doing it for a marathon, it's 2 or 3 days of your life that you might need to eat a little bit more than usual, but you'll need that glycogen when you get to the 35K mark of that marathon. So for this occasion, go with it. But it might be that in other parts of your training or life, then you can't afford to eat that much carbohydrate and you may not need it anyway.
So let's talk then about its practical recommendation for a female who has, let's say, committed an hour a day to train. And that could be resistance training, total body. That could be more moderate intensity, steady state, or HIIT sessions. But let's say they're devoting 7 hours a week to training, hour a day. Is there something special they need to do with fueling in terms of timing to the session, or just in the day? Or would you say 1 hour a day is probably not big enough to move the needle and just don't do anything special?
Look, it depends on the type of exercise you're doing in that hour. And for some people, it'll be challenging for them, like it's still a workout for them. But in terms of the absolute energy expenditure of the session, for someone who doesn't have a lot of muscle mass and someone who's not yet aerobically fit or able to do the resistance training, whether it's a neuromuscular thing or just an overall, I'm not used to this and I need to get my head around it, it may be that for some of the more start out sessions that there's not necessarily great requirements that increase, but for someone who's doing intense exercise and an hour can make an hour really happen and hurt, then I would consider making some special fueling ideas. And it could be something like having extra in the pre-session meal or having something during, but it could be just taking what you would normally eat, but just spreading it around the day so that a lot of it's more focused around that session of exercise rather than just having it. A lot of people can get into this sort of pattern of not eating very much in the early part of the day and having most of their food at night. But if they're doing their exercise earlier in the day, then they're not really using most of that food to support the exercise sessions. Whether it needs to be extra food or just good timing of that food, that's something you probably need to have an individual consult with somebody to get the bigger picture of what they're trying to do.
Yeah, let's talk about the timing, because many people with work, family will try and fit training in before the day gets derailed with being the human taxi and then going to work and getting the kids ready. And this is where fasted versus fed training comes in. And I know if we had this conversation with your husband, John, he might say, let's look at it from a molecular perspective. When we train with low carbohydrate after the fast, overnight fast, we're upregulating certain cellular signaling pathways. You must have very interesting conversations around the dinner table about this stuff. So where does training before breakfast fit into training after breakfast from a pragmatic perspective?
I guess it depends whether the goal is to get the training done or whether it's to try and tweak something else out of it that's special. And for somebody who's just getting the training done, I would say go with what your lifestyle dictates. And it might be, I need as much sleep as I can and I'm just going to get up and get out the door. Or it could be that I have a fairly squeamy stomach, and if I have anything to eat before I exercise, I have to wait a long time until I can do it comfortably. So there are, for some people, some difficulties with eating before. But on the other hand, some people just love to get up and have something and they can run quite nicely. Or sometimes if you're doing other types of exercise like swimming or riding, there may not be as much of a sort of a gastrointestinal discomfort problem. But if you're then moving into the territory of being a more focused athlete with specific goals, then you might break up some of those training sessions into which are your key sessions for the week, where you wanted to do it at a higher intensity, higher quality. And you might also be wanting to do something that's simulating race day. So if you're going to do a marathon and you're going to be consuming carbs during the marathon, you need to have done some of your training sessions where you've tried that out. And you also need to do some of those sessions where the better quality is achieved because you're better fueled. But on other occasions, you might say, I'm going to do this one deliberately fasted because there's the evidence that you may get a better molecular response to that training and gain some benefits that way. And that's the whole art of periodizing training, and periodizing nutrition should go along with that to say, what are the goals of this session and what's the best nutritional approach that can get the best out of it?
So 2 follow-up questions, and I'm certainly one who by and large trains fasted because I'm a cyclist, and frankly, I just do not like fitting into Lycra after breakfast. It's not a good look for anyone. And the other is with a squeamish stomach, and if I'm going for a run, that drag on the whole GI tract, that's also not pleasant for anyone as well. So I would always consider, if I do have a longer, more quality session, I'm going to try and eat a little bit more at night, so that is present in the liver and the muscle when I wake up. Is there an error in that thinking? And I could always take carb during the training session if hypoglycemia was occurring.
Yeah, certainly having something more the night before is going to help with your muscle glycogen. Your liver glycogen is probably going to be low after the overnight fast because that's what our livers are doing, just keeping us tided over between meals. And so you may start off with lower liver glycogen, but most people can regulate glycemia. And if it is a problem, then you've got that option of taking in carbs during it. And sometimes it might be just a matter of preventing the hypo so that you don't have an unenjoyable session. But the other thing you could be thinking about is this the session that you want to do a good quality workout? So that might mean that you do want to take in some carbs during, so that then you do have an ability to work at higher rates of carbohydrate oxidation, and or practice what you're going to do in the race so that it's not a foreign thing. There's so much behavioural training that we need to do for competition that you can't, it's not just you want to get your gut able to absorb it, you've got to be able to remember to consume it. And sometimes I can remember the first triathlon I did, and I'd got all my bidons filled with the best sports drink and whatever, and just didn't have the skill set riding in a bunch to be able to reach down and get that bidon out of the bike cage. So I should have practiced that a bit more often to make sure that when I did need to do it on the day, I could do it without creating a lot of anxiety around whether I was going to fall off or get pushed off or something like that. So there's a lot of differences between what am I doing this for, and is it to do some exercise and just get the benefits of the exercise, versus is this targeting a competition goal and there are some elements around that competition that I'm going to have to practice.
Have you seen, you've done a lot of work in this field, you and John, Have you seen any gender differences in how one responds to training before breakfast as opposed to being fed?
I don't think those studies have been done in sufficient quality and quantity to say that there are sex differences. I probably think that there's, as I said, there's individual differences, and that might be based on training status, and it might be based on a whole lot of other things other than sex. And a lot of it could be around what are the goals of what you're trying to do. Sometimes when I discuss training with people, I've got friends like you or athletes I've worked with like you that can go out the door and do exercise and don't seem to feel any fuel deficit, and others that just couldn't manage it, that the session would be so unenjoyable and of such low quality that they'd feel it wasn't worth doing. Start with what you know about yourself and then what the goals you are trying to achieve, and then work out something that sort of fits both the science and the practice and the insight and experience that you've had from previous uses of it.
Because the argument has been made that women should avoid training before breakfast of any kind because there's more profound changes in cortisol, but there's also a hypothalamic response, which then changes energy intake and expenditure throughout the day due to inherent gender differences in those neuroendocrine pathways. What is your gut feeling about this if we haven't got direct research?
Look, I don't have any conviction that that's a real thing. Stuff goes in phases and fads at them. And every time I pick up my phone, and if I start scrolling through, whether it's Facebook or Twitter, whatever, I don't know how many things I get telling me about cortisol levels. And I don't know when that became a thing. There's so many ideas about what supplements you should be taking, and then the one I'm getting at the moment, I don't know why my algorithm just changes, and I'm not sure whether I've had a conversation with people it's overheard or whether I've looked at something in disbelief. But once you spend time looking at something, then you keep getting more of it. But I'm getting all this stuff about tendons and perimenopause and menopause and the terrible things that happen with this gluteal tendinopathy, which seriously, it amazes me that these fads can just become so quickly, they just permeate everything. I don't know of any evidence around this, and it certainly might be something that if we did the right kind of studies in 10 years' time, we could have some confidence that there's something to it. But I'm not doing anything particularly well, no, energy availability is important. And yes, if you have low energy availability, so you're not consuming enough calories for the exercise that you're doing, that can be one of the scenarios in which there's an increase in cortisol. But, and that, going back to what I previously said, that maybe females are more likely to underfuel might make them more at risk of that. But I don't know of any really strong evidence that says that females per se are going to have more of a problem in terms of the way they exercise, fed or fasted, in terms of a cortisol response that makes me say everybody should be doing it this way every time. I'd rather look into the individual and understand the situation I was dealing with and what we're trying to do and change and achieve, rather than have a one size fits all.
And I think that's what many people are trying to do, is just create a very easy, here's the answer. Don't do this because you are male, you are female. Just out of interest, if you did want to measure cortisol, let's say you're part of the public, you are stressed and over exercise, you don't sleep well, and you think, oh my God, I have high cortisol. How would one actually measure that? Because you can't just go and get a blood test and get one picture in time. Cortisol jumps all over the place. Could you explain
Does
to us
and
how cortisol is actually measured with rigor?
Look, we often measure it in a couple of different scenarios in our studies. We look at fasting cortisol levels, especially when we've been doing studies with low energy availability where we've put an intervention in. And we've also looked at it in terms of the pulsatility of cortisol. Would love to do a 24-hour study of that to look at what's, as you said, jumping around. But because of the amount of blood you'd have to take for that, because of the pulsatility, we've done a couple of studies where we've done it in just overnight scenarios, and that sort of limits and it mightn't be perfect for cortisol per se, but often we're looking at a range of hormones. You might be looking at growth hormone and luteinizing hormone as well. And if we're trying to think of, okay, we can only do 8 or 10 hours of measurement of this, and what would be the best time period where we can do that, overnight is probably the best one for the kind of work we're doing.
I want to talk about fueling. We've talked about fueling. I want to talk about recovery, but you just mentioned collagen and tendon. So let's just quickly dive into that one. You've actually done a study on collagen and Achilles tendon. You've also done some work looking at nutritional interventions to stop muscle wasting after, I think, an ACL reconstruction. Some of the questions that I have been asked to ask you is essentially, what's the deal with collagen? Is there any intervention for aging, achy joints? And that is a common complaint around menopause, that I feel sore and I get sore from training and my joints hurt, and I'm finding that a barrier. Is there anything in your nutritional basket that can address this?
I don't have any confidence that there's one thing that fixes everything. The work that we've done with collagen, we're still working on it, obviously, but we haven't found anything that's really enticing me to take collagen supplements. The project that we're doing with the ACL at the moment is really looking at whether we can, with protein, whey protein, address not so much the collagen or the tendon, but looking at the muscle repair post, that often with ACLs and other injuries like that, in the rehabilitation, there's just never an ability to gain back the muscle in that injured leg. There's always a deficit, and whether that's just because there's some biochemical or molecular disturbance that occurs around the injury that never quite heals, or whether the fact that the injured area means that you don't train it to the same level again, we don't know. There's a whole lot of different explanations for that, but we're wondering whether a systematic approach to exercising with protein support might be able to, and we're looking at some other ideas, whether creatine and caffeine at the same time meant that you could try and get that injured limb to train harder to overcome that deficit. So that's the approach that we're taking there. But the collagen story is a tricky one, and I've got friendships with both Keith Barr and then the Luke Van Loon and Stu Phillips group, and they're on the opposite sides of this. That Keith has found benefits with the engineered ligament model that he has, and we've done one of the studies with him. One of the things that I struggled to get my head around then is that with this engineered ligament, it's bathed in a solution that's not physiological. And what you can do outside the body is different to then what happens inside the body and what that real ligament would be experiencing when it's in a living body. I've certainly read a lot of Keith's case studies, and they are encouraging, but then when you look at the work of Stu and Luke, where they're looking at what happens with some protein synthesis, whether it's collagen or muscle or whatever, the collagen just does not seem to have the same quality in terms of being able to turn on protein synthesis as other proteins. So I'm like everybody, just sitting back waiting to have more research to work with. But in the meantime, I probably...
to your own drink. You're a marathon runner, and
Yes.
so you have a lot of ground impact force. Is it something that you just cover all bets and add 10 grams of collagen to your whey, or do you even drink whey? I know you have chocolate. Maybe chocolate is how you...
I have a lot of chocolate milk and I'm a good yogurt consumer. I don't use a lot of protein supplements per se. I tend to buy milk that's a higher protein content and would tend to have the Greek yogurts. At times I have, if I've not been able to get those, had a protein powder that I've added to make my food source higher. But most of the time I would just use food sources. I haven't had any reason to, I guess, to try the collagen per se. I am interested in the whole effect that it might have on bone, but not enough to motivate me to do it myself, I suppose. But I'm still able to run, and I don't have a lot of injuries. I don't have any sort of joint or ligament problems. So while I haven't got a problem, I feel like I'm doing the right things, and probably most of my sort of focus is on the fueling aspects for each of the sessions and then the recovery afterwards.
Yeah, so let's then talk about that. And perhaps many people who are experiencing joint pain, tendon pain, potentially are missing a little on the fueling side and a little bit on the recovery side, which means that after, again, we'll call it 1 hour of either total body resistance, interval training, or some steady state, what in proximity to that training session would you recommend the average female be consuming?
You mean before, during, after, or a
I'm
bit of
thinking
both?
straight afterwards now.
Yeah, so look, I always try and get the protein back pretty quickly.
And what's
Occasionally
the
I'll
reason
do,
for that? Why quickly and why not at the next meal, dinner time?
yes, and look, I know that there's now studies coming out showing that the timing may not be as important as we think, but that's one of those things where I think it makes sense to have things available at the time. And sometimes when we're relying on those studies to look long term, if you look at the studies that look at the acute hours, the 5 hours post an exercise session, you can see the benefits in terms of muscle protein synthesis immediately. Now, what happens then is if you follow that protocol for 6 weeks or 12 weeks, the studies that show that then translated into a better outcome for the group that did the more timiest or more equally spread protein isn't convincing. But on the other hand, those very long-term studies are hard to do. And controlling everything that somebody does in 12 weeks often means that you're sort of getting so many other extraneous factors into the study that at the end of the 12 weeks, it's just impossible to see a detectable difference because too many other things were happening. And maybe this is just, you pick your biases. I still feel that it's a good idea to, and I certainly know that, for me, that if when I'm planning things, if I've got my recovery nutrition happening straight after the session, I know it's going to happen, and I don't get onto the next activity of the day and suddenly get completely distracted and unable to get back to what I was planning to do, and then suddenly it's afternoon and I haven't refueled. So for me,
So
it's
it seems from a very practical perspective, it's not going to be missed. And it also is going to prevent that potential under eating and low energy situation where you finish training, think I'll have lunch, you get waylaid in the office, and then suddenly 6 hours have passed and you haven't fueled. So it's more a pragmatic perspective. I
And
think
look, the other
certainly.
thing is I love food. I love eating. When I finish my exercise session, I'm quite happy to have that reward and say that's something I really enjoy doing.
Yeah, we both agree. Chocolate milk after training for the win. Before we finish on the collagen story, you've done some really interesting work on bone broth. And tell us what you've done here, because as soon as collagen became popular and Keith Barr's work was showing that there might be a potential for at least engineered ligaments, you then looked at bone broth being a rich source of collagen precursors, but you found something interesting. So why don't you tell us what you did and what you found?
Yeah, so this was some of the work that Rebecca Alcock did as part of her PhD, and she was working with the Brumbies rugby team up in Canberra as part of her PhD activities. And they were obviously very interested in recovery aspects and injury aspects. And that was about the time the sort of paleo diet was being promoted, and the CrossFit people were particularly interested in the bone broth consumption. And because we know when you're making bone broth, you're cooking bone for a long period, and that you're breaking down parts of the bone, and there's collagen that comes out of the bone and the marrow, etc., that then goes into the bone broth. You could understand that, oh, this could be a good source of these collagen precursors, some of the amino acids, the proline and the glycine that are high in collagen. And so what we did, and what Rebecca did actually, was we sourced bone broth from a lot of different places. So we went and bought commercial bone broth. We went to some paleo cafes and bought what they had on offer, and we then got a whole lot of different recipes to make bone broth in different ways, and they differed with the timing of the cooking and what sort of bones went into it, but also whether you're adding some acid into it, because if you're putting vinegar or something else into the broth, you're also helping to break down some of the bone and the collagen. She tried a whole lot of different ways of finding bone broth. And then we took samples of them and looked at the amino acid content, and they had such low and variable amounts of the proline and the glycine amino acids that we were looking for, that we just began to realize it just wasn't a reliable source. If you were trying to match what the collagen supplementation protocols were doing, you wouldn't be able to rely on bone broth to do it. People might like having it for other reasons. It's funny, I had an email today from a friend of mine who works in basketball, and she said that she'd been over in Europe with a tournament and had noticed that the Eastern European athletes, they were hosted in various parts of Eastern Europe, and noticed that the normal food that was offered had bone broth every day, and that these athletes were consuming it. And she wondered whether that was one of the ways in which they could explain their more injury resistant characteristics. She works in NBA, and so she's used to having these players come to the US and notices the difference in the risk profiles of injury. And she asked me whether I thought it was the bone broth that was doing it. And I said, based on our results, not just because it was variable, but maybe it's not what they were consuming, but what they were not consuming. And that a lot of American athletes of that same age would be eating macas and fries, etc.
Very different diet, right?
Very different diet. So maybe it wasn't the bone broth, but bone broth is a marker for not having a junk food diet.
Right, right. Now, what you've done with bone broth is really similar to what you found with caffeine in coffee. And I've got a book somewhere in here. It's not organized in here, but you've got a book on coffee and performance. And now I like coffee. My last blood test, the pathologist said my blood was about 99% coffee. So this is something that's near and dear to my heart. But I think you guys went around to every major city, you got coffee, you analyzed it, and it had markedly different caffeine. And we'll often see people walking into the gym. I work in a gym situation. They'll be drinking the coffee and training. And what I picked up from your book is it takes a period of time for the caffeine to get into the system to do its job. But also every coffee is markedly different. This is really cool stuff. Tell us what you did, what you found.
Yeah, so I have to give credit to Ben Desborough here. He was one of the
Yeah.
authors of this book, and he went into different malls in Brisbane and got, I think something like 99 different espressos. So he asked for the same order at each coffee shop and came back, and on average, the amount of caffeine that was in the espresso was the typical 80 milligrams. So on average, but it ranged from 25 to 225 across different coffees. And that's to do with the barista and the beans and what one place calls an espresso versus a double espresso, whatever. So it just shows that there is a difference, that if you were to try and use it for a very specific purpose like sport performance, then maybe it's not your best source. And so I wouldn't use it in competition. But on the other hand, it does have a pretty quick reaction time. I know in the old days we used to think about caffeine and how we had to wait for an hour before its effect was maximised. But look, most people know within 3 sips of a cup of coffee you feel better, because it does
Why
have,
is that? Is
well,
it like you
we
found
think
with carbohydrate and mouth sense thing? So just
there is a
step
mouth
back.
sense. Yeah,
Right.
I've got a colleague that thinks there's also just a nose sense. The smelling of coffee makes you feel better. Now, I'm not a coffee drinker, which is where you and I are completely different.
So what are
So
your 3 C's? You got Chanel, you got coffee, you got chocolate, and you've got, what is your third?
champagne.
Champagne. I knew
Yeah.
there was a third C.
Yeah. But so it does have a sort of a quick entry, but I would say to people that if you're doing this as a daily training thing and it's for enjoyment, choose what you like to have. And okay, because there's not just been Ben's study, there's been another study that was done where someone went into the same coffee shop every day and still found a difference between what they got on Monday and Tuesday when they asked for the same order in terms of the caffeine content. But perhaps that's less variable. And if you have something that works for you, I think, and particularly if it's a nice coffee, once you start putting all the syrups and the creams and stuff in it, that goes crazy. So I would suggest that rather than, if you're going to go and do a workout and you like to have some caffeine just to get yourself going in the morning, then use coffee, using it because it's going to have some pleasure aspect, but also because it's going to have antioxidants, some other good things in it. I'd rather do that than have a stick of caffeinated gum or whatever. So I'd use caffeinated gum for my marathon where I want to get the dose right. But if I was a coffee drinker and I was doing my sessions in the morning and I needed that to get me out of bed and ready to start the day, I think I'd prefer something that I enjoyed and something that has got a better health benefit because of the other components of the coffee.
And how quickly is it? You've said there's probably some mouth and some nose sensing, but realistically, from getting the caffeine into the mouth, when will we notice a performance or a cognitive benefit?
Some of the studies have shown 5 or 10 minutes you start to see benefits. It might peak a bit later. And if you're wanting to have it really immediately or as quickly as possible, then you've got the choice of using the gums where you're getting some of the absorption through the cheek cells, the buccal cells, rather than swallowing it and going through the gastrointestinal system. But look, it depends on what the sport is or what the effect needs to be, because if you're doing something, I don't know, let's say it's a power lift. If you're a weightlifter or a power lifter and you're looking for a single effort, then you might need to get the timing a bit more precise than that. But if you're doing a bike race or a training session that's going for a period of time, you want a little bit kicking in soon, but you want the effect to be sustained so that it's there for the whole session. So maybe there's a bit more leeway with when you take it, and then you've got a longer lasting sort of an effect.
And you've also done work on caffeine and sleep. So what would be your recommendation for having your caffeine but not ruining your sleep?
Oh, that's a really good one. And that really comes down to what sort of a metabolizer of caffeine you are. Shona Halson and I've been, or Shona mostly, supervising Carissa to do a PhD on caffeine. And she's just published a paper. In fact, I saw it all over Twitter this morning, X this morning, with Shona promoting the results of a study of taking different doses of caffeine, but also looking at meta-analysis. And there's, for some people, a very strong effect of caffeine, and that you need to remove probably 8 to 10 hours between caffeine intake and sleep if you want to perfect the sleep that you're getting to get the best sleep. And what was interesting is that often people couldn't tell, like they didn't know the effects of caffeine were occurring as badly as they were. Sometimes people just can't sleep, and so they'll tell you that. But there was still an effect with some aspects of sleep quality and architecture that when caffeine was consumed closer to the bed session. But look, other people can be drinking coffee right up until they go to bed and seem not to have that same sort of disturbance, where other people, if they have anything after 2 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it's a disaster. So that's one of those big areas that we're still looking for what would be the best marker. There are some candidate genes that we know can signal caffeine metabolism, but they don't always work out with a very strong correlation between this type of the polymorphism of the gene versus another one in terms of the effect of caffeine and how long it lasts. So there's obviously a lot of different genes that are contributing to the total caffeine effect, and it's not just how quickly you're metabolizing it, it's where you have your adenosine receptors around the body and how active they are in responding to caffeine. And so I think you can get tested for a couple of things now, but I don't think they have enough sensitivity to give the total answer. Most people can tell you whether they're a fast or a slow caffeine metabolizer just by when they have to stop drinking before they notice the effect.
And you also mentioned, and absolutely, but you also mentioned that some people don't realize the impact it is having on their sleep. Where are we at with wearables that are tracking your sleep, from rings to straps to bed mattresses? Is it giving us a good enough ballpark so we can make comparisons, or is it just not there yet?
Look, I think some of the Aura and Whoop rings are getting much better at measuring sleep and some aspects of it. And this is not my area of expertise. I rely totally on Shona to teach me how to understand sleep. She will tell you that something like a SomFit is that's a more portable device that sort of stands in for polysomnography, which is the gold standard. That's something we've been using in our studies, and that's better at being able to measure the architecture of sleep. The Whoops and the Auras can tell you if you're sleeping or not. But interestingly enough, whether they're totally getting the picture or not, I don't know, because we've just done a study in our new metabolic chamber and we've had people sleeping in the metabolic chamber, and we wanted to measure resting metabolic rate. So we would wake them up in the morning and then ask them to lie there and not go back to sleep, but we would be measuring metabolic rate while they were doing that. And they had their SOMFIT and their auras on. And when you look at the data from the SOMFIT and the aura, they'll tell you that person was asleep. And yet we know the person wasn't, like we could see.
Yeah.
And so whether
Doesn't inspire confidence.
whether just behaving like someone who's sleeping in the sense of having no other movement, which we asked them to achieve for the resting metabolic rate, maybe there's some aspects that some of the techniques and protocols just cannot pick up.
Yeah,
That's,
which is frightening because the literature says these wearables are really only good at detecting wake versus sleep, whereas the stages of sleep, they're not quite there yet. So the fact that you guys are even picking that up, and I know that for myself when I'm awake, if I just practice deep breathing, but I know I'm awake, my ring will say that I'm asleep. I have one last quick question for you because our time is short, and that is bone health as we age for a female. You've done lots of work in carbohydrate, in energy availability, and bone. What would be the best practical strategies you would talk about for a female who exercises and wants good bone health?
Doing some resistance exercise is really important, I think. We need to be able to load the bone, and sometimes people think of running, the weight-bearing activities being good for bone, but it's really, bone's quite deaf, and after the first 8 steps, it doesn't hear anymore. So the kind of exercise you need to be doing is stochastic and changing direction and pulling on the bone. And I think that's probably where getting into the gym and doing some resistance and even plyometrics could be helpful. Adequate calcium, adequate carbs, adequate energy. We're interested to look at the effect of having some calcium pre-exercise on bone health. We've had a couple of studies in athlete populations where we've found that this, for some reason we don't understand, when people do aerobic exercise for a period, there's a sudden drop in the blood calcium levels, which is something that our body needs to maintain homeostasis around. And so what seems to happen is that when you start exercising and the calcium drops, then you turn on mechanisms that send a hormone that helps a little bit of bone to break down to just prop up the blood calcium levels to keep everything straight. Now, what we've been able to show is that if you take calcium prior to exercise, we've done it with food, other people have done it with calcium supplements, then when that change happens as a result of exercise, the calcium that's coming in from the gut, because you've just consumed it, can take the place of breaking down a little bit of bone and just reduce the degree of that turnover of the bone as a result of exercise. And now we don't know that that then leads to better bone, but it's not a disadvantage, and it could fit in with the kind of pre-event meal that you're having anyway.
Right. Interesting. Louise, you've been extraordinarily generous with your time. I've asked about 1/25 of the questions I wanted to ask you. So maybe one time down the track, we can do a part 2, but there's still so much to talk about with REDS and iron absorption and different supplements for females. But thank you very much for your time. And
thanks for having me.
Yeah, I hope we can do part 2. Thanks so much.
Bye then.
Thanks for tuning in to the Stronger with Time podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing or sharing it with someone who would benefit from hearing this. And if you're ready to go deeper, the 9-week Science of Thriving course is available now. The link is in the show notes.